What if you were told that during the filming of The Passion of the Christ, Jim Caviezel didn't just act as Jesus, but literally carried the cross and shed his own blood on camera? What you're about to discover goes far beyond what was publicly disclosed. There were moments on set where the line between acting and reality became so thin that even the medical team was left without explanations. We're talking about a solid wooden cross weighing 70 kilograms, not a foam prop like in other Hollywood films. And when it fell on Jim Caviezel during an unplanned take, what happened next was captured by the cameras and remained in the final cut of the film. But few know that blood was completely real. Mel Gibson never intended to make an ordinary Christian film. He wanted brutal authenticity, visceral realism, and was willing to cross all boundaries to achieve it. What many people don't know is that this obsession with truth nearly cost his lead actor's life multiple times. Jim Caviezel was struck by lightning during filming, was incandescent for seconds, had his shoulder dislocated while carrying the cross up Calvary, contracted pneumonia and hypothermia, and suffered accidental whippings that left a 35-centimeter scar on his back. But the most disturbing thing of all is that no one was prepared for what would happen when that 70-kilogram cross raised upon the shoulders of an already exhausted man finally collapsed. It was supposed to be just another take of the long Via Crucis sequence. Jim Caviezel had been carrying that solid wooden instrument for days, climbing up and down the rocky terrain of Matera, Italy. His body was at its limit. His right shoulder had already been dislocated during a previous fall, but he insisted on continuing. Mel Gibson watched everything with an almost religious intensity, knowing he was capturing something rare, something that transcended cinema. The cameras were rolling when it happened. Without warning, without preparation, the cross lost its balance, and all that weight came crashing down directly onto Caviezel's head. The impact was brutal and immediate. The wood struck his skull with enough force to partially bury him in the sand. The silence that followed was deafening. The technical crew ran to him, but something strange happened at that moment. Instead of screaming in pain or immediately asking for medical help, Caviezel remained there, semi-conscious, but still in character. When they finally looked at his face, they saw blood. A lot of blood. He had completely bitten through his tongue and the inside of his cheeks on impact. The red liquid dripped down his chin, stained the white tunic, dripped onto the sand. And then someone realized the cameras were still recording. What should have been discarded as a filming accident became one of the most powerful scenes in the film. When you watch The Passion of the Christ and see Jesus spitting blood after being struck, that's not elaborate makeup or special effects. It's Jim Caviezel's real blood, the result of real trauma, captured in real time. The actor himself would confirm years later in an interview that those images are authentic. Sometimes we wonder what exists beyond our physical world, and other times strange things happen that make us question everything we thought about life. In situations like these, better understanding can mean the difference between being confused and having clarity. That's exactly what our ebook, The Secret of Jesus' Apparitions, offers. Consider acquiring this incredible material for a symbolic value. This exclusive material offers keys to decipher divine signs and understand how Christ manifests in our days. Your contribution allows us to maintain this independent research work. The link to acquire the material is available in the pinned comment. But the falling cross wasn't the only moment when Caviezel's body became a literal part of the story being told. During the flagellation sequence, the whips were choreographed with millimetric precision to never touch the actor's skin. But in one take, something went wrong. The angle changed slightly, just a few centimeters, and one of the barbs of the Roman whip tore through Jim's back, opening a 14-inch wound. Again, the cameras captured everything. Again, Caviezel didn't stop. He incorporated the pain, transformed the accident into performance, and that moment of real agony merged with Christ's staged agony. Sources close to the production revealed years later that the makeup artists had difficulty differentiating between the real injuries and those applied for the film. The weight of the cross wasn't just physical. 70 kilograms of solid wood being carried for hours, day after day, under the scorching Italian sun or in the biting cold of dawn. Caviezel lost weight drastically during filming. His body entered a state of extreme exhaustion that doctors consulted during production described as dangerous. There were moments when he could barely keep his eyes open between takes, but whenever Mel Gibson shouted action, something changed. Crew members reported in unofficial conversations that it was as if another presence inhabited the actor during those scenes. His face took on an expression that wasn't exactly his. His eyes reflected a depth that went beyond acting technique. When the shoulder dislocated for the first time, Jim refused proper treatment. He wanted to continue filming immediately. The pain was unbearable, but he insisted he needed to use it. That pain had a purpose. In one of the film's most intense scenes, where Jesus tries to embrace the cross while carrying it, that gesture wasn't directed by Gibson. It was the only way Caviezel found to support the weight of the wood without his dislocated shoulder collapsing completely. What appears to be a moment of mystical devotion in the film is actually a man desperately trying not to fall under the weight of his own dedication. And then came the crucifixion. 2 full weeks were dedicated to that sequence. Jim Caviezel hanging on that cross, hour after hour, take after take. The cold was cutting, the icy wind swept across the rocky plateau, and his body began to react in alarming ways. He developed severe hypothermia during the night shoots. Doctors warned he needed to stop, but Caviezel refused. He said if Jesus truly went through that, he needed to feel at least a fraction of it. Pneumonia came next, his lungs too weak to fight the exposure to cold. Still, he returned to the set. There's a detail that few people know and that production tried to keep secret for years. During one of the crucifixion takes, Jim Caviezel suffered a minor heart attack. His heart, subjected to extreme stress, momentarily failed. He was rushed to treatment, but didn't talk about it publicly until much later. In a recent interview, he revealed he needed 2 heart surgeries after filming, one of them open heart, as a direct consequence of the physical trauma his body suffered during the Passion of the Christ. He attributes part of those heart problems to the moment he was struck by lightning, an incident that by itself already seemed impossible, but that gained even stranger contours when the assistant director was also struck, not once, but twice, on the same set. Raniero Gabrielli, one of the most experienced assistant directors in Italian cinema, was on that set during the Sermon on the Mount scene. Jim Caviezel stood at the top of the hill in full Christ tunic, thousands of extras below, when the sky suddenly darkened. There was no storm forecast. The clouds appeared out of nowhere, black and swirling, as if a storm formation had been pushed through a time warp and instantly materialized over them. Then the flash. The light was so intense that the cameras were temporarily blinded. It thundered with a force that physically shook the ground. And then the smell. Burnt hair, burnt fabric, ozone hanging thick in the air. Jim Caviezel was directly struck by lightning. He stood there, burning, flames dancing around the edges of his robes, hair smoking, while everyone stood paralyzed by disbelief. His entire figure was surrounded by a luminous halo, electricity still visible around his body for long seconds after the strike. Gabrielli ran to him, checking if he was alive. But Caviezel was in shock, dazed, but physically unharmed in a way that seemed statistically impossible. Paramedics later confirmed he should have suffered severe organ damage or cardiac arrest from that direct strike. But apart from a slight burn and transient arrhythmia, he was strangely intact. But the story doesn't end there. 16 days later, during filming of the crucifixion scene on another slope, the sky darkened again without warning. The same kind of unearthly cloud formation, the same impossible speed of condensation. Gabrielli was with a lighting rig preparing the next shot when the lightning repeated. This time it was he who was struck. The lightning passed through the metal structure, through his body, and grounded itself in the rocks below. Stunned, burned but alive, he was taken to emergency treatment. 2 weeks later, when he returned to the set against medical advice, because he felt a mystical need to finish this project, he was struck again. A second lightning bolt in the same man on the same set of the same film. The statistical probability of being struck by lightning once in a lifetime is about 1 in 15,000. The probability of being struck twice is 1 in 9 million. But 3 people struck on the same small film set over the course of a few weeks. Meteorologists consulted later had no explanation for the storm formations that appeared out of nowhere over that specific territory. Local residents of Matera, who had lived there for decades, said they had never seen such atmospheric activity in that region. But these weren't the only phenomena that defied scientific explanation. Many times during filming, electronic equipment failed for no reason. Cameras that had been checked and rechecked suddenly stopped working during key emotional scenes. Lighting went out at moments when the intensity was most palpable. Crew members began whispering that the set was haunted. Some stopped calling it haunted and began using another word: sacred. Something about that rocky Italian terrain, in combination with this particular act of storytelling, seemed to summon forces beyond ordinary reality. These weren't phenomena that could be easily dismissed as imagined or exaggerated. They were physical, verifiable events, witnessed by dozens of people simultaneously. Cameras captured some of those moments, production logs documented others, and the people who were there never forgot. However, the costs went beyond the physical. Jim Caviezel, who entered this project as a rising Hollywood talent with extraordinary commercial potential, essentially burned his career for this film. His decision to play Christ for Gibson came with the awareness that it might ruin his chances at major Hollywood roles, but he went ahead anyway. After the premiere in 2004, Caviezel was almost immediately blacklisted by major studios. Roles that had been promised to him evaporated. Phone calls stopped coming. Meetings were cancelled. In interviews he gave over the years, Caviezel was extraordinarily frank about it. He said his agent warned him, "You'll never work in this town again." And for years that prophecy seemed to come true. The most lucrative phase of his career, when he could negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts for big action films or leading romantic roles, was over before it really began. Instead, he found himself being cast in independent projects, low-budget Christian films, and television series, where he could earn a fraction of what major studios were offering him. The reasons for this exile were multifaceted. Partially, it was typecasting. When an actor becomes so powerfully associated with the role of Jesus Christ, audiences have difficulty accepting him in other roles. But other factors were more sinister. Hollywood, an industry dominated by certain political and social sensibilities, saw the Passion of the Christ as ideologically toxic. Accusations of anti-Semitism, though fiercely contested by Gibson and Caviezel, cast a long shadow. Caviezel's associations with conservative causes, his outspoken Catholicism, and later involvement in controversial topics like the QAnon movement further alienated him from the mainstream. In 2016, more than a decade after The Passion, Caviezel finally found commercial success with the television show Person of Interest, which ran for 5 seasons. But even that was a kind of consolation prize for what could have been. In an alternative version of history, where he didn't play Christ, Jim Caviezel of 2004, an attractive 30-something with considerable talent and screen presence, would likely be an A-list leading star, competing for roles that instead went to others. Instead, he became a figure more known for his one defining performance and the consequences of that choice than for a continuing corpus of outstanding work. Mel Gibson paid his own toll, though in different ways. The film cost $30 million to produce, a sum Gibson financed himself after every major studio refused to touch the project. It was a spectacular gamble. the kind of financial risk that can destroy even an established director. If the film failed, Gibson would not only lose his entire fortune, but would be ruined as a financial cautionary tale in an industry that already treated him with growing skepticism. And then, 2 years after The Passion was released, came the drunk driving arrest in 2006, where Gibson's recorded anti-Semitic remarks became headlines worldwide. Combined with earlier controversies surrounding the allegedly anti-Semitic portrayal of Jews in The Passion, this disaster seemed to confirm critics' worst fears. Hollywood closed ranks, directing offers dried up, actors began publicly distancing themselves from him. His reputation went from respected star and director to poisoned figure whose very name became a political liability. Gibson slowly began rebuilding his career years later, directing films like Hacksaw Ridge in 2016, which received multiple Oscar nominations and demonstrated that his cinematic talent remained intact. But he never fully recovered his position in Hollywood's hierarchy. He remains a controversial figure, admired by some as a courageous artist willing to risk everything for his convictions, despised by others as someone whose personal failings invalidate his artistic achievements. And through it all, he maintained a deep and seemingly immutable connection to the Passion of the Christ, describing it repeatedly as the work of his life, the only thing that truly matters in his filmography. For years, Gibson worked quietly on a sequel, a project he described as even more ambitious than the original. The Resurrection of the Christ went through multiple script revisions, more than 6 different versions written by Gibson, alongside his brother Donald Gibson and screenwriter Randall Wallace. The project faced constant delays, funding problems, and widespread skepticism about whether it would ever be realized. Gibson described the script as an acid trip, explaining that to tell the story properly, he would need to start with the fall of the angels and explore spiritual realms that cinema rarely dares to portray. It was a concept so vast and metaphysically complex that many doubted it could be translated into a coherent film. In January 2025, reports emerged that filming would begin in March, with Jim Caviezel returning to the role that defined his life. Events were organized where Caviezel would appear, with descriptions specifically mentioning that production was just 1 month from starting. The expectation among Christian communities was palpable. 21 years after the original, there would finally be a continuation that would explore the resurrection with the same visceral intensity that the first film brought to the crucifixion. But then, in October 2025, came a shocking announcement that caught everyone by surprise. Jim Caviezel would not return as Jesus Christ. Lionsgate, now distributing the project as a 2-part film scheduled for 2027, announced the role would be taken by Jaakko Otonen, a relatively unknown 36-year-old Finnish actor. The official justification cited Caviezel's age and the need for digital rejuvenation, but for those who had followed the journey, the decision seemed to carry a deeper weight. It was as if the connection between Jim and the role was so intense, so physically and spiritually costly, that repeating it would be asking too much. Or perhaps there was an implicit recognition that what happened between 2003 and 2004 was unique, unrepeatable, and shouldn't be recreated even if it were possible. Caviezel, who had expressed in April 2025 his expectation of returning to the role, accepted the decision with his characteristic grace. He issued no bitter or resentful statements. Instead, he spoke about how God knows the right time for all things, and that perhaps his journey as Jesus was complete exactly as it should be. There was a quality of closure in his words, as if he understood on a level that transcended professional ambition that some roles are meant to be played only once, and that trying to recapture that experience might diminish its sacredness. The production of The Resurrection of the Christ began at the legendary Cinecittà Studios in Rome, the same location where the original film was partially shot. The project will be divided into 2 parts, with Part 1 premiering on March 26, 2027, appropriately on Good Friday, and Part 2 releasing on May 6, 2027, on Ascension Day. Gibson promised an even more metaphysical and spiritually ambitious approach, exploring Christ's descent into hell, the limbo of the righteous, spiritual dimensions, and the events of the 3 days between crucifixion and resurrection that remain shrouded in theological mystery. But for those who lived the original experience, no sequel, however technically impressive or spiritually ambitious, will be able to replicate what happened between 2003 and 2004. What occurred on those Italian hills, under those skies that defied meteorology, with an actor whose body literally bled for art, transcended filmmaking. It was a convergence of faith, suffering, dedication, and something inexplicable that perhaps can only be described as divine presence. The Passion of the Christ wasn't simply a film that portrayed Jesus' crucifixion. For many involved, it became its own form of crucifixion, an experience of dying to oneself in service of something infinitely greater. Romans 5 verse 8 reminds us that God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That central truth, that act of sacrificial love, was what Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel tried to capture, and in the process, they themselves experienced versions of that sacrifice. Gibson sacrificed $30 million and eventually his reputation. Caviezel sacrificed his physical health, his promising career, and years of his life struggling with the physical and spiritual consequences of the role. And everyone around them, in some way, was touched by that sacrifice, altered by it, transformed by witnessing it. Today, almost 22 years after its release, The Passion of the Christ remains the highest-grossing R-rated film of all time in the United States through 2023, an achievement that speaks not only to its commercial success, but to its lasting impact. It's regularly shown in churches during Holy Week. It continues to be used as an evangelistic tool, and testimonies of spiritual transformations attributed to watching the film continue to come from around the world. People report conversions, emotional healings, family reconciliations, and profound spiritual awakenings that trace directly back to those 2 hours and 6 minutes of brutal and beautiful cinema. The 70-kilogram cross that fell on Jim Caviezel wasn't just a wooden prop. It was a physical symbol of the weight that each person carries when they choose to follow truth, regardless of cost. The real blood that stained the costume wasn't just a production accident. It was a visceral reminder that telling certain stories requires literal shedding, not just metaphorical. And the inexplicable events that haunted that set, the lightning strikes, the healings, the spiritual transformations, weren't random coincidences. They were signs, for those with eyes to see, that when you approach the sacred with genuine intention and real sacrifice, the sacred responds. If these revelations awakened something in your spirit, demonstrate it by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing in the comments how God has manifested in your own life. Your testimony may touch the heart of someone who needs this message right now. Join our community of truth seekers and continue with us on this journey of spiritual discoveries that can change your life forever. Because in the end, the question isn't whether The Passion of the Christ was just a film. The question is, what will you do with the truth it revealed?